right. I'm DC Fortune. I am originally from New England, and I'm now living here in Pennsylvania. Um, I'm 57 years old. I think after 50, it all sort of goes fuzzy until you hit like a number that gets you, like benefits. Uh, um, I am a pastor. I am the minister at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the Susquehanna Valley in Northumberland. Um, let's see, I said I'm 57, and um, I am transgender, although I have spent some time in almost all of the letters of the alphabet rainbow, um, coming out originally as bisexual in college, and then identifying a lesbian, um, and then trans, and now I don't know if I'd say gay, but I'm perhaps back to bi, but that's not relevant, really.
And your pronouns are?
My pronouns are he, him.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in between Massachusetts and Maine, which on a map would say New Hampshire, but I had my grandparents, my grandmother was in Massachusetts, and my family, my father and my stepmother and I lived in Maine for most of my growing up. So I would go there for, vacations and stuff like that.
When did you move here to the Valley?
June. Well, May. I got here in May of 2022.
Talk to me about some of your background, education, and how you got into, is it probably called the seminary? Or?
Yeah, seminary, yeah. Oh, boy. So the first time I went to college, I thought I wanted to be a teacher. I thought I wanted to teach children math and science. And then I realized that teaching involves getting up really early and dealing with a lot of children that are fast-moving and loud. And I'm not a morning person, and that just it was not a fit for me. So I focused for a while on psychology, and then I ended up getting into journalism, and then I got into the trades. I got into the building trades. I worked on a couple of different bridge projects in Maine. I became a union sheet metal worker. I moved from New England to Minnesota for a newspaper job, and while I was out there, got my bus license. I drove transit bus in Minneapolis for a little while. Came back to New England, did some more newspaper work, and eventually got into being a home repair contractor. And it was at that point that I had a sort of a ministerial call experience, and went off to seminary. And that would have been in 2010, I think. Yeah.
So you haven't been a pastor for very long. I guess 2010 is still 13 years ago.
2010 is when I started seminary. I graduated seminary in 2014, was ordained in 2015. So officially ordained ministry, this is year 7, 8-ish. But I've been working, once I started seminary, I was working either part-time or full-time in churches as I went. I worked in some volunteer positions, some paid positions. I did what we call pulpit supply, where minister wants a day off, so they'll hire a local seminarian to come and preach on a Sunday. And I did a fair amount of that during seminary. So I've been working in churches steady since 2010.
What you mentioned, I think you said a religious experience or religious calling.
Yeah.
Go into a little bit of detail about what that means.
It's sort of entertaining because as Unitarian Universalists, we don't generally have one of those like sky opens, sun shines down, God speaks directly to you. That's not a thing that we typically do, but that's very much what happened. I was in a worship service in Ellsworth, Maine, and I was listening to the minister, and I had at previous to that, I had been doing some volunteering on political stuff, and I had people where I was doing some speaking and some fundraising and some organizing, and people would say, you should be a minister. And I was like, that means committees, and committees are where good ideas go to die, and no, not for me. Well, so I'm sitting in this church in Ellsworth, Maine, and it was winter. I don't remember if it was December or January. It might have been January, February. It was one of those times when the sun comes in at the angle that it only hits in the wintertime. And it was just really warm and wonderful. And this guy is talking, and I felt this very odd sort of physical presence, like this giant, almost like beach ball sized entity was sort of pressing on me, and not in a scary way, but in a pleasant and making a point sort of way. And honestly, the words that came to my mind in that moment were, well, shit, I'm going to be a minister. And I figured whatever kind of divine entity there might be, use that language to make sure I knew it was for me and not the guy next to me.
Did you have a similar revelation about your own sexuality and gender identity?
Oh,
was there a light that
heavens.
shined on you?
Oh, God, no.
Okay. Yeah. What's your coming out story?
Well, yeah, because I've spent so much time in all the different letters, it's sort of a complex thing. I was thinking today, sort of preparing for this, I remember at 4 or 5 thinking, I'm a boy. And being aware that the world was not going to let that happen, my world. I also remember around that time, which would have been late 60s, early 70s, that the career options for girls at that time, at least in my world, were nurse, secretary, teacher, housewife, nun. And none of those things appealed to me or felt like a real option at all. It just wasn't right. I had the typical, policeman, fireman, want to be able to do cool stuff, So I ended up a minister. I'm not sure how that happened, but yeah. I had that feeling, but there was no room to express it. There was no room to talk about it. There was, we as society do our very best to get kids to conform to what we think they ought to be. And so there's a family story that at the age of 4 or 5, for my birthday, I got a doll, and I got the crib, and I got the high chair, and I got all the stuff, and I cried and cried and cried because the doll got all the presents, and it was my birthday. And I didn't it was clear early on that just was not my jam. Grew up in a very rural, conservative part of Maine. My town had less than 2,000 people in it until, almost 2,000. More cows than people. High school, there was no, I didn't fit in, but I didn't know if that was because I was from Massachusetts and I was living in Maine, or, I was one of the smart kids because I'd had other educational experiences that the kids in that rural town didn't, or if it was just me internally. But I knew I didn't fit in, and I didn't, the normal boy crazy stuff that my friends were into just felt weird. Went off to college, drank a lot. In hindsight, I can look back and say I was I was trying really hard to escape me, whatever me was. I wanted to be anybody but me. Good God. Got sober. Spent some time doing spiritual work. Did a bunch of banging around, traveling, went to Minnesota and drove a bus in Bar Harbor, Maine, and some other stuff. And, oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry, college. Back in college, I came out originally as bisexual, and I had an inkling about that. Again, it was one of those, I tried really hard not to be this thing that I knew I was. I dated a lot of guys. I tried really, really hard, and it was just an abysmal failure.
And that was through high school?
No, college.
Okay.
College now. Because I got sober, and eventually I went back to college. And then I met a couple of people who were gay, were lesbians, and I began to see in them the stuff I'd been feeling all along, and I began to have language to describe what was going on with me, and I began to have people who were safe to talk to about it, who weren't going to freak out. And so as I got more comfortable with the concept, I became more comfortable with acknowledging that I was identifying that in my own self. And so I came out as bi, and then pretty quickly transitioned to came out as lesbian. And this would have been the late 90s, so there was much denim and flannel and folk music. The Indigo Girls, Tracy Chapman, trips to Provincetown, Massachusetts. And honestly, I have like a decade of popular music and culture. I just no clue what happened. People, that was Indigo Girls phase. Sorry, and had a number of significant relationships that lasted multiple years. When I was first attending seminary, I went to a workshop put on by a guy named Alex Rohn, who's in Portland, Maine. He's a lawyer, and he was a transgender activist. And he put on a workshop where he explained gender as not just binary, not just flip a coin, heads or tails, but as a spectrum. And he explained that there's a lot of different ways gender takes place. We have biological sex, which is not specifically binary. It's not either XX or XY, because there are other variations of that. There's XXY, which is Klinefelter syndrome, and there's XYY, and there's a bunch of other things. So that's not even just A or B, right? Gender identity, which is what we feel inside, can be on a scale also from hypermasculine to hyperfeminine, and a lot of places in between. There's gender presentation, which is how we present to the world, how we dress, how we act, how we behave, how we interact with other people. And somebody can have a gender presentation that is highly feminine, but know themselves to be quite masculine inside. And there's this whole complex variety of options that I didn't, I thought I had A or B. I thought it was binary, 0 or 1. Those are my choices. And again, once I had the language for that, I thought, oh, I feel more masculine. That makes sense now. That makes sense. I've always felt more masculine. So I was able to, okay. And so I still identified as lesbian, but in my sexual orientation, But in my sexual identity, my gender identity was more non-binary, and I there's a famous author, Jennifer Finney Boylan, recently just came out with a book with Jodi Picoult, who wrote Great Small Things.
I'm familiar with Jody. I read Mad Honey.
Right. Okay.
So I'm not sure what else.
Same author,
Okay.
right? But yeah, but they have a book now. It's on the New York Times bestseller. But Jennifer Finney Boylan, it used to be a writing instructor at Colby College, and transitioned from male to female and wrote a book about it and stuff. But what she says, which is really easy to help understand, is sexual orientation is who you want to go to bed with. Gender is who you want to go to bed as. And that makes a big difference. And so I understood myself to be attracted to women, but I understood myself to be non-binary, right? In this sort of place in between masculine and feminine. My body was my body. I didn't always agree with it, but I didn't really have access to like. So much of this journey has been about emergence and self-discovery. When I think about the last 40 years and how I've developed intellectually and how I've developed emotionally and how I've developed spiritually, it only makes sense that this other part of my person grows and develops as well. Which is not to say that everyone goes through changes like this. Not everyone does. But for me, it was the more I learned, the more I was able to find a place that felt comfortable for me. So in seminary, I went from using she, her pronouns to using they, them. And I did that for 4, 5, 6 years. And in the past few years, I've been using he, him. And I've been using DC, which are my initials, just because, oh my God, it is a horror show of legal stuff to get name changes. And I was adopted. So like my birth certificate's all screwy. Right, because, yeah, it's just, so it's really a challenge. So I use DC, and my license says non-binary here, which is nice. I have that option. But still, I go to use a credit card, and they look at the name, and they look at me, and I'm like, yeah, it's me, But I know, I don't look like that name. Yeah, I get it. So now I came here. It was really fascinating. The search team that was looking to hire a new minister, of course, they read all of my biography and resume and all of this stuff, and they selected me from the people they were talking to, and I came here, and it never occurred to them to tell anybody that I was transgender. Because they were just like, we were looking for a minister. We found one. Mm-hmm. Like, your story's your story to tell, not ours. And that's really how it sort of went here. People were like, oh, okay, sure, thanks. Okay, like I was the minister first, and this other thing was just a piece of my life that now they know, and they're like, oh, all right, It's interesting that some of the traits that I carry with me from being socialized female and how I interact with people really works well in a pastoral setting, because people identified as female in our society are taught how to be gentle, how to listen, how to be empathetic, how to be pastoral. And so that helps a lot. Um, I've had more than one time I've had people say, you're not like other people. Yeah, I know, I'm not like other people. Weird things that I've discovered in the past couple of years. For years and years, when I moved through the world as a woman, there's other stuff that you get taught as a woman in this world, and that is to be afraid of men. Because all of us have an experience of being threatened or harassed or hurt or worse. And I remember how I would move through a store, Home Depot, right? And how I would look at people, and you just look and you sort of know where to place yourself about being safe and stuff like that. And now I see women looking at me and placing me in the older white guy category and sort of adjusting how they stand.
That's weird. Is that weird?
It's weird and it sucks. It's really sad. It's really sad because I want to say, no, you don't understand. I'm okay. Yeah. For a long time when I was moving through the world as a woman and I was doing construction stuff, like I was the safe person for other women to ask in the aisle at Home Depot. Now they perceive me as some creeper, trying to hit on them in the hardware aisle. And it's, no, just lag bolts would be better for that. I don't get to smile at babies as much because people are like, why are you smiling at my kid? Because your kid's adorable. Mm-hmm. But men are not permitted that as much. You're allowed, but not too long because then it gets creepy.
Back up just a little bit. You mentioned, being 4 or 5 and kind of having those thoughts. And then, so throughout your childhood and your teenage years, did you ever try to present yourself other than what you were assigned at birth? Did you?
I rejected all attempts at femininity. Okay. There's this wonderful picture of me. I think I'm 3. And it would have been a Memorial Day, like Mother's Day, sort of 3, which would have been 1968, maybe, right? Little white patent leather Mary Janes, tights, skirt, hat, bonnet. Would have been Easter if I was dressed up in that many clothes. It would have been cold enough. And there's this picture of me in the park, and I'm all dressed up in all this fluff, and my knees are dirty, and there's a hole in one knee of my tights, and I look absolutely miserable. And oh my God, they tried to make me a girl. I always wanted pants. I never wanted skirts. I never wanted dresses. I don't think I have any pictures of me in high school or college when the world was trying to form me into that mold. Just all of them, like if I look at them, I see them and it just, it hurts. It hurts my heart. I remember what it felt like to be squished into something that didn't fit. I've explained it to friends before, like, I once bought a really cool pair of Doc Martens. I love those boots. They hurt my feet, but I love those boots. And I tried to wear those boots, and every time I wore them, they hurt, and I'd get a blister, and I'd be miserable. And that's sort of how I went through life, trying to be a girl. I tried, and it hurt, and it was miserable. There were some times, when I was as happy as I could possibly be. And then once I knew, the more I knew, the more I needed to expand. And like I sort of internally outgrew where I'd been. You know, like when I had more room to be what felt comfortable, then I expanded into that space.
Did you, did people around you sort of know as you were growing up that this was the case? Did you face any kind of backlash from your peers or from family?
My family was not terribly functional, but when I came out, my father told me not to come back. My aunt did her best to understand, still tries to do her best to understand, loves me, wants me to be happy, that's what matters. Whatever shape you're in, that's fine. Which is really pretty great. But my father died in 2011, and we never reconciled. He never got to see me in grad school. He never got to see me winning awards. He never got to see me doing that stuff. It was. He had quadruple heart surgery at one point, and I did call. I called the house. How's he doing? And I talked with my stepmother, and I don't know if they ever told him I called or not. I never heard back. That's hard.
You mentioned you were adopted, so you know who your birth parents?
My father is my birth father.
Okay.
And I met my birth mother when I was 30. And we never got really close. I mean, I had a whole lifetime of other experiences, and I was in a very different place emotionally, spiritually, with my identity, than the rest of that part of the family. So, and she died 2016, 2017.
So not a real close relationship with
No,
her.
no.
Peers during high school? Did you?
High school, because I lived in such a rural conservative area, it was a really homophobic place to be. I did the best I could to fit in, but honestly, it always felt awkward. College, again, early 80s to mid 80s, and then I was drinking, and then I was sober, and it was still trying to conform, I figured if I kept trying all these different things, maybe one day I'd figure this thing out and I'd feel okay with it. It just never happened until I fell in love with my best friend. And I was like, oh, falling in love with this is very different. This is very different. Oh, okay. And that was like, but then I had to figure out, how do I move through the world with this new identity in a world that I know to be really homophobic? I was in college in Farmington, Maine. Farmington, Maine is in Franklin County, Western Foothills, up sort of towards Sugarloaf. At the time, there were more registered handguns than Democrats. It was not a hotbed of progressive thought. And so being out was dangerous. And I Oh, geez, I forgot about this stuff. Yeah, I got threatened on the regular. We started a gay straight alliance in college, and we had to have our bulletin board in the student union. We had to have our bulletin board locked under plexiglass because people would tear our stuff down and deface it. We would do public demonstrations and events and stuff like that, and depending on how they were publicized, sometimes the local folks would show up, and got my life threatened on television one time. That was exciting.
Well, what went on with that? If you don't mind expanding a little bit.
1989, maybe 90. I don't remember. We had our very first LGB. We weren't even doing T or Q or anything. We had a very short alphabet back then. LGB Awareness Week. It wasn't even Pride. It was awareness. And I, with a photocopier, made up reams of posters. And I went through probably 2,000 posters in a week. I'd put them up, they'd tear them down. I'd put them up, they'd tear them down. I'd put them up, they'd tear them down. We ended the week with, granted it was a provocative title, an event that we called A Public Display of Homosexual Affection. Keep in mind, it was March or April in Maine. It was cold, right? There was going to be no naked anything, trust me. And what we did was we said, this is what you're all afraid of. And we hugged each other. And we must have had a couple hundred students show up and some locals and, I mean, that was the world in which I grew up. I remember my father saying that all gay people, he would use a derogative, he would use a slur. The only good one's a dead one. I remember hearing that. They ought to line them up against the wall, shoot them all. I remember hearing that. It wasn't safe to come out. Yeah, and it took years after I left home till I could get to a place where I felt safe enough to come out.
So then you moved here last year.
Yep.
What are your experiences living here in the Selinsgrove area, running a church here in Northumberland?
The thing that always comes first to my mind is the food could use more spice.
Okay.
Flavor. I was here for 2 weeks and thought I had COVID because I couldn't taste anything. Turns out, no, I'm just in Pennsylvania. Oh, God bless us. I haven't had a peep.
Okay.
I haven't had a peep. It's interesting, like where I live, I've got neighbors on either side of me. One person, one side of them knows, and the other side doesn't know that I'm trans. They don't take the paper, so they didn't see the other article where I talked about being trans. And the guy across the alley from me knows, but he's the postman, right? So he delivers my mail. So when I saw him, when I first got here, I'm like, okay, you're going to see stuff coming to this name and to this name. They're both me.
Okay.
He's like, oh, okay, right? But honestly, it's been me.
Okay.
So what? I mean, because I tell you what, it's interesting. Moving through the world as a man is so much easier than moving through the world as a person with ambiguous gender. First off, the dress code is way more relaxed. For years when I flew, I would wear a Roman collar, right? Because it was way more difficult to be rude to a fat priest on a plane than to a fat lesbian, right? And that's the fact. If I didn't have my collar on, I would get, the body shaming sneers and snickers and like you'd fit if you lost weight, that kind of thing. Fat priest, nobody argues. Somebody my size in Home Depot or Lowe's, nobody looks twice. Yeah, it's weird. So moving through the world here as male, people just sort of automatically give you a pass just moving through.
Is there a certain way that you react? I guess if you don't have, if you're not seeing as much pushback in living here in the valley, but I was going to ask you if there's a certain way that you used to react versus a certain way that you act now when you face sort of that pushback or that discrimination. Is that too weird of a question?
The pushback I've always gotten before has been in relation to my not conforming to some standard. Whether it's my not conforming to some standard of femininity or not conforming to some standard of size or style or whatever, right? Now people see me as conforming. They don't realize how non-conforming I am, right? Because in our society, in our culture, in the United States culture, the normative is the white man, right? We don't talk about my friends who are white, right? We don't talk about my friends who are men. But if you have a friend who's a woman, you'll say, oh, my friend so-and-so. If the name's not clearly female, you'll identify that person as a woman. Often we will describe our friends as, oh, my friend such and such, who is black, who is Latino, who is whatever. I have become a part of the dominant group. At least according to everybody else. If they knew the whole transgender thing, then they'd probably look at me cross-eyed. But for the most part, they just see me as me and move on. It was the non-conforming before. It was your pronouns are they, them. Like, we don't understand that. Now my pronouns are he, him. People understand that.
So, last question, I guess, for you here. There's been a lot of headlines with, drag shows, transgender men, legislation coming up to the forefront. What do you want people to know about you and your community and people like you?
No one is ever going to be able to legislate transgender people out of existence. No one is ever going to be able to legislate queer people, LGBT, LMNOP, choose your letters, out of existence. Just as nature provides a variety of creation in flora and fauna all over, so are we made with a variety of expressions. Taking away health care from children is evil. Taking away mental health care from children is evil. Taking away health care or mental health care from anyone is evil. It seems like the LGBTQ population is the easy target, the ones that are safe to hate. You know, in the 1930s in Germany, it was the Jews that were safe to hate. Here in the United States, it is the LGBTQ community that is safe to hate. We're not going to go away. I remember in the 1980s when gay men and IV drug users were the ones that were safe to hate. And it was okay for them to die of AIDS. And that community organized to save itself from the world. And there are now organizations forming and working together to keep people safe. I have a colleague who's a religious educator in Oklahoma City who I talked to a couple weeks ago, and he said, I have parents coming to me saying, we need to leave Oklahoma because our child is not safe here. And we are not safe if we provide support for our child. Somebody can and will call Child Protective Services because we're getting our child the care that they need so they're not suicidal. I just don't understand how people can hate someone so much that they want them to die. Like, is that your best hope for today? Is watching someone suffer? Like, what has happened that this is what gives you pleasure, watching someone in pain? What is your thought process that has taught you that it is okay to make someone hurt because you can? Some people will die without the medicine that they need. Some people will die because they can't terminate a pregnancy. 40% of the homeless youth in America are homeless because they're LGBTQ and were thrown out. Those kids are more likely to engage in risky, self-destructive behavior as a way to numb the pain of where they are. They're more likely to engage in alcohol and drug use. They're more likely to engage in unsafe sex practices that cause unintended pregnancies. They're more likely to engage in survival sex in order to make money to be able to live on the streets. And this is only going to make that worse. I wasn't able to come out until I was long and far away from the home I grew up in. And when my father died, we'd been estranged over 20 years. He missed a whole section of my life because he rejected me. People are going to lose their kids. They're going to lose their families who know that it's not safe at home and move away.